The air in Redemption Creek hangs thick with dust and malice. It's a tangible thing clinging to the back of the throat, coating the tongue with the bitter taste of judgment. On a raised platform outside the saloon, a makeshift auction block, stands a young woman. Her name is Alara, though no one here uses it. To the jeering crowd, she is merely the consignment, the mail-order bride rejected and returned like faulty merchandise. The man who sent for her, a portly merchant named Jebediah Barlow, stands smugly by the saloon doors, arms crossed over his chest, ensuring his public humiliation of her is complete. The auctioneer, a man whose face is a roadmap of broken veins, clears his throat. All right, folks, settle down. What we have here is a unique opportunity. A ripple of cruel laughter moves through the assembly of ranchers, miners, and aimless drifters. This is the lady sent for by our own Mr. Barlow. Traveled all the way from back east, she did. Now, Mr. Barlow, being a man of particular tastes, found her wanting. He lets the word hang in the air, ripe with insinuation. Says the goods are spoiled, but his loss is your gain. She's young, strong-backed, I'd wager. Can cook, can clean. Won my bid for a year's labor. Silence, thick and watchful. Alara stands rigid, her hands fisted at her sides, her chin held at an angle that is a fraction too high to be mistaken for anything but defiance. A deep, angry scar cuts a path from her left temple down to her jaw, a permanent, puckered line that pulls at the corner of her eye. It's this mark, she knows, that earned Barlow's disgust. It's this mark that has made her spoiled. She feels 100 pairs of eyes on it, dissecting her, dismissing her. $1, a drunken voice slurs from the back. If she keeps her face to the wall, more laughter, sharper this time. The auctioneer grins, showing yellowed teeth. $1 it is. Do I hear too? From the edge of the crowd, a man listens, his posture still, his head cocked slightly to the side. He leans against the wall of the general store, a worn hat pulled low over his brow. He hasn't seen the woman on the block, not in the way the others have. He cannot. Silas Thorne lost his sight to a fever 3 years ago, and the world has since been a tapestry of sound, scent, and texture. He'd come to town for salt and flour, not for the spectacle of a woman's ruin. But he can hear it all, the greasy satisfaction in the auctioneer's voice, the hyena-like cackles of the crowd, Barlow's self-righteous breathing. And then he hears another sound, one that cuts through the ugliness like a clear, silver bell. A quiet, shaky breath. It's the sound of a spirit refusing to break. It's a whisper of sound, but to Silas, it's a shout. In it, he hears terror, yes, but beneath it, there is a bedrock of dignity, a stubborn refusal to shatter. He hears the woman shift her weight, the faint rustle of her worn calico dress a sound of quiet resilience. He hears the fight in her silence. $2, Barlow himself calls out, a smirk in his voice, just to see who's desperate enough to take my leavings. The auctioneer points a grubby finger. Mr. Barlow bids $2, a fine bit of sport. Do I hear $3? Alara flinches at Barlow's voice, a small, involuntary movement. The sound is a faint hiss of air, but Silas catches it. He pictures a cornered animal, heart hammering, but still unwilling to show its throat. He thinks of his ranch, silent and empty. He thinks of the 100 small things he can no longer do, the constant, grinding frustration of navigating a world he can no longer see. He needs help. But more than that, in this moment, he feels an unexpected, fierce surge of something he'd thought long dead, a protective instinct. This is a cruelty he can, at least, stand against. Her voice, when she finally speaks, is not what he expected. It isn't a plea or a sob. It is low and steady, though frayed at the edges with strain. I am not spoiled goods, she says, the words dropping into the charged silence. I am a woman. The sound of her voice strikes Silas like a physical blow. It's clear, with a cadence that speaks of a better education than anyone in this dusty town possessed. It holds the tremor of fear, but is laced with the steel of her will. Is the voice of someone who has held on to her own worth when no one else would grant her any. It is a voice he wants to hear again, in a place where it doesn't have to fight to be heard. $5, Silas says. His voice, gravelly from disuse, cuts across the square. Heads turn. People squint, trying to place the speaker. Silas pushes himself off the wall, his hand finding the familiar worn wood of his walking stick. He doesn't need to see their faces to feel their surprise. The blind rancher. What use does he have for a woman he can't even look at? The auctioneer squints. Who said that? Thorne? Is that you? It is, Silas says, his voice gaining strength. $5. For her contract. Barlow lets out a derisive snort. What's the matter, Thorne? Your eyes gone so bad you can't see what you're bidding on? She's got a face that'd scare a horse. I'm not buying a face, Silas says calmly, turning his head in the direction of Barlow's voice. I'm hiring a laborer. I'm told she's strong-backed, and I heard her voice. That's enough for me. He pauses, letting the weight of his words settle. Unless you think a woman's worth is only in what a man sees when he looks at her, Barlow. The jab hits its mark. A few people shift uncomfortably. Barlow sputters, his face purpling. The auctioneer, sensing the mood turning and eager to close the deal, bangs a makeshift gavel on the platform. $5 to the blind rancher. Going once, going twice. Sold. Alara stares, her heart a wild bird in her chest, towards the man who spoke. He stands apart, his face unreadable under the shadow of his hat, his stance solid and unwavering. He hasn't seen her scar. He hasn't seen the worn-down hope in her eyes or the threadbare state of her dress. He heard her. In a world that had judged her solely on a flaw in her skin, one man had listened. And with a few quiet words, he had bought her. Not her. She corrected herself fiercely. A year of her labor. A year of sanctuary from the likes of Jebediah Barlow. She took another shaky breath, the sound of it barely audible. But across the square, Silas heard it, and it sounded for the first time like the beginning of relief. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw her true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The journey to Silas Thorne's ranch was a study in silence. He'd paid the $5, signed a crude contract the sheriff had drawn up with bored indifference, and then led her to a buckboard wagon waiting near the livery. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, one hand on the wagon's side, the other holding his walking stick, which tapped a steady, rhythmic beat against the hard-packed earth. He didn't ask for help, and Alara, still reeling from the whiplash of the day's events, didn't offer any. She climbed onto the hard wooden seat, her small bundle of possessions clutched in her lap, and waited. The town of Redemption Creek receded behind them, its mocking voices and leering eyes fading into the vast, indifferent expanse of the high plains. The landscape was starkly beautiful, a sweep of golden grasses under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Mountains, jagged and purple, bruised the distant horizon. Alara watched it all, feeling as small and exposed as a single blade of grass. Silas handled the reins with a familiarity that was born of years of practice. His hands, calloused and capable, seemed to know the temperament of the horses by feel alone. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving town, and the silence stretched, growing heavier with each turn of the wagon wheels. It was not a comfortable silence. It was a space filled with unspoken questions. Alara stole glances at him. His profile was lean and weathered, a face carved by sun and hardship. There were lines of sorrow around his mouth that his blindness did not hide. He was a man accustomed to solitude. She could feel it radiating from him like heat from a stove. She was the property, for a year, of a man who lived in a world of darkness. The irony was not lost on her. She, who had been cast out for being unsightly, now belonged to a man who would never see her. The thought should have been a comfort, but it was strangely unsettling. It was a different kind of invisibility. Her journey west had started with such desperate hope. Answering a mail-order bride advertisement had been her only escape from a life of drudgery and pity back in Ohio, where her scar made her a subject of morbid curiosity and a poor prospect for marriage. The letters from Jebediah Barlow had been clipped and businesslike, but they had promised a new life, a home. She'd allowed herself to dream of it. A small, clean house, a measure of respectability, perhaps even quiet affection. The reality had been a slap in the face. Barlow had taken one look at her as she stepped off the stagecoach, his face contorting in disgust. "They sent me damaged goods," he declared loudly to the station master, and that had been the end of her dream. The auction was his final, public act of repudiation. "The ranch isn't much," Silas said suddenly, his voice startling her. "Just a cabin and a barn. Enough land to run a few dozen head of cattle, if I can keep up with it." "I'm not afraid of work," Alara replied, her voice quieter than she'd intended. He nodded, seeming to consider her words. "Barlow is a fool, but the people in that town, they follow his lead. You won't find much welcome if you go back there." "I have no intention of going back," she said, a spark of her earlier fire returning. "Good." The word was simple, final. He flicked the reins. "There's a stream about a mile from the house. Water is clean. The well by the cabin is good, too. The land is hard, but it's honest. It doesn't judge." The implication hung in the air between them, unlike people. When they finally arrived, she saw what he meant. The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of gnarled cottonwoods. The cabin was small, built of sturdy, weathered logs, with a stone chimney and a sagging porch. The barn stood a little ways off, its roof in need of repair. The place had an air of neglect, not of decay, but of a task that had grown too large for one person. It was the physical manifestation of a struggle. Silas brought the wagon to a halt. "We're here." He set the brake and sat for a moment, listening. He seemed to be mapping the space with his other senses. "The cabin door is straight ahead. 3 steps up to the porch. Be careful, the middle one is loose." He didn't offer her a hand as she climbed down. She stood for a moment, taking in her new home. It was stark, isolated, and yet, after the suffocating cruelty of the town, the silence felt like a blessing. The air smelled of pine and dust and dry grass, a clean, wild scent. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry lonely and sharp. "The cabin has 2 rooms," Silas explained, his voice coming from behind her as he unhitched the horses. "A main room and a small storeroom off the back. I sleep in the main room. The storeroom, it's small, but it's dry. There's a cot in there." He was giving her a space of her own, a door she could close. It was a gesture of consideration she hadn't expected, and it touched her more than he could know. "Thank you," she murmured. He simply grunted in acknowledgement and led the horses toward the barn, his steps sure and practiced in this familiar territory. Alara watched him go, then turned and faced the cabin. 3 steps up. She tested the middle one. It wobbled precariously. He was a man who paid attention to the details his body could still perceive. She pushed open the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was Spartan and shadowed, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, occupied one corner. Everything was meticulously organized, placed where a hand could find it without the aid of sight. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, each in its place. A row of tin cups was lined up perfectly on a shelf. This was a world ordered by touch and memory. She found the storeroom. It was little more than a closet with a narrow cot, a few empty shelves, and a single small window high on the wall. But it was clean, and it was hers. She set her meager bundle on the cot and felt a profound, bone-deep weariness settle over her. She had been bought, sold, and transported all in a single afternoon. She leaned her head against the rough wooden wall and closed her eyes, the auctioneer's sneering face swimming in her memory. Then she remembered the sound of Silas Thorne's voice, calm and steady, cutting through the noise. I heard her voice. That's enough for me. She didn't know if she was a prisoner or a guest, an employee or a charity case. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Alara knew one thing with certainty. She was safe. For the first time in a long time, she was safe. And in the profound silence of the cabin, broken only by the whisper of the wind outside, that felt like everything. The first days on the Thorn Ranch unfolded in a quiet, cautious rhythm. Alara and Silas moved around each other like two solitary planets that had been forced into a shared orbit. Their interactions were clipped, functional, centered on the tasks at hand. "The woodpile is by the north corner of the cabin," he'd said the first morning. "The axe is sharp." "I can handle an axe," she'd replied, and she had. She spent the morning splitting wood, the repetitive, physical labor a welcome balm to her frayed nerves. Each clean crack of the wood felt like a small victory against the helplessness that had threatened to consume her. Silas, meanwhile, worked in the barn, mending tack by feel. She watched him from the woodpile, marveling at the dexterity in his hands. He worked slowly, but with an unshakable purpose, his fingers reading the worn leather like a scholar reads a familiar text. His blindness was not a weakness, she began to realize, but a condition that had honed his other senses to a razor's edge. He knew when she was approaching by the change in the air pressure, the faint crunch of her boots on the dry ground. He could tell which horse was which by the sound of their chewing. In the evenings, they ate at the small table, the space between them filled with the sounds of cutlery on tin plates. Alara had taken over the cooking without being asked, finding a sparse but adequate larder of flour, beans, and salted meat. Her first meal for him was a simple stew, but she took care with it, adding wild herbs she'd found growing near the stream. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "This is good," he said. It was the highest praise he had offered for anything. A strange partnership began to form, unspoken and organic. She became his eyes. "The fence is down in the west pasture," she'd report. "3 posts are rotten at the base." He would nod, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Show me." She would lead him there, describing the lay of the land, the position of rocks, the way the ground sloped. He would place his hand on her shoulder for guidance, a light but firm pressure that sent a strange warmth through her. Once there, his hands would take over, feeling the splintered wood, assessing the depth of the holes, and he would direct the repair with an expertise that left her humbled. She would hold the new posts steady while he drove them into the earth with a heavy mallet, his swings powerful and unerringly accurate. One afternoon, while they were mending the barn roof, a task that felt perilous and vital, a gust of wind caught a loose shingle and sent it sliding. Alara cried out a warning. Silas, who had been feeling his way along a beam, froze instantly. "Where?" he asked, his voice sharp with tension. "To your left. About 2 feet. It's sliding toward the edge." He didn't move. He trusted her completely. "Tell me when it's gone." She watched the shingle skitter to the edge and drop to the ground below. "It's gone." He let out a slow breath and nodded. "Thank you." In that moment, on that precarious roof, a new layer of trust was forged between them. He was trusting her with his physical safety, and she was learning to trust that her words, her observations, had value. Her scar, the mark of her shame, became irrelevant in their shared world. He never asked about it, and she never offered an explanation. To him, her face was just the source of the voice he'd heard, the voice that now narrated his world for him. She found herself forgetting about the scar for hours at a time, a freedom she hadn't known since she was a child. The pull on her skin was just a feeling, not a judgment. But the outside world did not forget so easily. A week after her arrival, they needed supplies. The trip back to Redemption Creek was a thing Alara dreaded. Silas seemed to sense it. "You can wait with the wagon at the edge of town if you like," he offered, his tone neutral. "No," she said, her chin lifting. "I am your employee. I will not hide." Her resolve wavered when they pulled up to the general store. The sight of Jebediah Barlow standing on the boardwalk, talking with Sheriff Brody, sent a cold dread through her. Barlow saw them. His eyes narrowed, and a cruel smile spread across his fleshy face. He said something to the sheriff, who chuckled. As Alara helped Silas down from the wagon, Barlow swaggered over. Well, Thorn, enjoying your purchase?" He leered at Alara. "Has she been earning her keep, or is looking at that face all day enough to curdle the milk? Before Alara could even flinch, Silas stepped slightly in front of her, his body a solid shield. He turned his head toward Barlow, his sightless eyes seeming to look right through him. "She's a harder worker than you've ever been, Barlow," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "And I'd rather have an honest scar to look at than the dishonest face you show the world every day." Barlow's face went from smug to furious. "Why, you blind old fool? Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Sheriff Brody drawled, sauntering over. His gaze was dismissive as it swept over Alara. He was an extension of the town's contempt, an official seal on their prejudice. "No problem, Sheriff," Silas said calmly. "Mr. Barlow was just admiring my judgment. We'll be on our way." He placed a hand on Alara's arm, a silent signal. "The flower is just inside the door to the right, isn't it?" he murmured to her. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice thick. She guided him inside, leaving Barlow and the sheriff watching them with open hostility. The air in the store was thick with unspoken judgment. The storekeeper's wife served them without a word, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Alara could feel the eyes of other customers on her back, on her scar. But this time it was different. Silas's words echoed in her mind. An honest scar. He had defended her. He had stood between her and the ugliness of the world, and he had not wavered. On the ride back to the ranch, the silence was different. It was no longer heavy with questions, but full of a new, fragile understanding. She was beginning to see the man behind the stoic exterior, a man of deep integrity and quiet strength. And she dared to hope that he was beginning to see her, too, in the only way that mattered to him. As they neared the valley, she found her voice. "The clouds are turning purple over the mountains," she said softly, "and the light is making the grass look like it's on fire." Silas turned his face toward the west, as if he could feel the color she was describing. A small, rare smile touched his lips. "Tell me more," he said. And she did. For the rest of the way home, she painted the world for him in words, her voice steady and clear, and he listened as if it were the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The ranch was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a shared space, a world they were building together, one word, one act of trust at a time. The threat of the town still loomed, but within the bounds of their valley, a delicate and powerful bond was taking root. The seasons began to turn, the fierce heat of summer giving way to the crisp, golden melancholy of autumn. The rhythm of life on the ranch became a familiar dance. Alara learned the language of the land, and Silas learned the language of her voice. He could tell by a slight tremor if she was tired, by a lift in her tone if she'd found something that pleased her, a patch of late-blooming wildflowers, the comical strut of a prairie chicken. Their shared labor wove them together. They harvested the meager garden she had coaxed from the dry soil. They repaired the barn roof, working in a seamless tandem of sight and sound. They rode out together to check on the cattle, Alara describing the terrain, guiding her horse alongside his, her presence a constant, reassuring anchor in his sea of darkness. One evening, a sudden autumn storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised gray. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, rattling the cabin's single window. A cold, driving rain began to fall. Alara built up the fire while Silas secured the shutters. The small cabin, usually a place of quiet space, now felt intensely close, a tiny fortress against the raging elements. They sat at the table, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. The storm made conversation feel necessary, a way to push back against the roar of the wind. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" Alara asked, her voice soft. Silas was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire he could not see. "I was a draftsman back in St. Louis," he said finally, the words seeming to be pulled from a deep, locked place. "I drew plans for buildings, bridges. I loved the lines, the precision of it all." Alara pictured his hands, so capable at mending tack and swinging a mallet, holding a fine-tipped pen. It was a life she couldn't imagine for him. "What happened?" "My wife, Sarah," was from out here. She always missed the sky. After she passed, there was nothing left for me in the city. The noise, the crowds, it all felt empty. So I sold everything and came out here. Bought this place. For 2 years, I could see it. I learned the land, the cattle. I wasn't very good at it, but I was learning. He paused, his throat working. Then the fever came, took my sight, left me with this. He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the darkness around them. It was the most he had ever revealed about himself. Alara's heart ached for him, for the double loss he had endured. A wife, and then the world she had loved. She understood now the profound depth of his solitude, the grief that lived behind his quiet competence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, a quick, dismissive gesture. "It was a long time ago. What about you? That scar? You don't have to tell me, but I've always wondered what kind of fight you were in." He asked it so simply, without pity or morbid curiosity. He asked about the fight, not the wound. She took a deep breath. "It wasn't a fight. It was an accident. A pot of boiling water when I was a girl. My father, he wasn't a careful man. The old shame, the memory of the searing pain and her father's drunken apology afterward, rose in her throat. After that, people looked at me differently, like I was broken. That's why I answered Mr. Barlow's advertisement. I thought maybe a new place would be different." "He didn't deserve you," Silas said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. His eyes worked, but he was blind to what mattered. In the warm, firelit intimacy of the cabin, with the storm raging outside, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He saw her past not as a flaw, but as a testament to her survival. She saw his blindness not as a disability, but as the source of a different, deeper kind of perception. Their bond, however, was a private truth in a world that only understood public rules. As winter began to dust the mountaintops with snow, their fragile peace was shattered. A lone rider approached the ranch one afternoon. It was Sheriff Brody. He dismounted heavily, his gaze sweeping over the tidy woodpile, the mended fence, and finally settling on Alara, who stood on the porch, her heart beginning to pound. Silas emerged from the barn, his head cocked, listening. "Thorne," Brody said, foregoing any greeting. "The town council had a meeting." "I'm sure it was riveting," Silas replied dryly. Brody's eyes narrowed. He was not a man who appreciated irony. "It was about you. And her." He jerked his chin toward Alara. "Folks are talking. It ain't decent. A man living out here alone with an unmarried woman. Especially one he purchased." The sheriff savored the word, making it sound as sordid as possible. "She is my employee," Silas stated, his voice like stone. "I have the contract to prove it." "A piece of paper from sham auction doesn't make it right," Brody sneered. "Barlow's been stirring the pot. Says you're keeping her here against her will. That a blind man can't possibly provide for her or protect her. She is free to leave at any time," Silas said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Isn't that right, Alara?" All of Alara's fear, the old, familiar dread of being powerless, rushed back. Brody was looking at her, waiting. Her voice was the key. "I am here of my own free will, Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Mr. Thorne has been nothing but honorable." Brody grunted, clearly disappointed by her answer. "That may be as may be, but the council has decided. It's an affront to the community's morals. You have two options, Thorne. You marry her, proper and legal, in the church, or we're charging her with vagrancy and sending her to the county workhouse." The threat was a physical blow. A workhouse. It was a prison sentence. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. "You can't do that," Silas said, taking a half-step forward. "I can and I will," Brody said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "It's the law. Barlow has friends on the council. They want this situation rectified. You have until Sunday. The preacher will be expecting you. If you're not there, I'll be back with a wagon for the girl." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a terrible silence in his wake. Sunday. That was 3 days away. The ultimatum lay between them, heavy and cold as a block of ice. Alara stared at the spot where the sheriff had been, her mind reeling. The workhouse. It was a place for the destitute, the criminal, the discarded. It was the end of the line. She had fled one kind of prison only to be threatened with another. She turned to Silas. His face was a grim mask, his jaw tight. He was trapped, too, forced to legitimize a relationship born of pity and necessity, or be responsible for her ruin. The thought was unbearable. She would not be his burden. "I will leave," she said, her voice strained. "I can walk to the next town, find work somewhere else. You won't look for me there." "No," Silas said, his voice absolute. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to find her in the darkness. "No, you will not. He will take me to the workhouse, Silas. You heard him. I won't let you be forced into a marriage because of me. It isn't right. And letting Barlow and that tin-pot sheriff drive you out is right," he countered, his voice rising with a rare, raw anger. "Letting them punish you for their own pathetic small-mindedness? I stood up to them once. I won't back down now. But to marry me?" Her voice broke. "A woman with a scarred face you've never even seen? A woman bought at an auction? It would make a mockery of you. They would all laugh." He finally found her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle but firm. He turned his face to her, and though his eyes were sightless, his focus was so intense it felt as if he were looking straight into her soul. "Let them laugh," he said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper. "Do you think I care what they think? I have been a pariah in that town since the day I lost my sight. A curiosity, an object of pity. What more can they do to me?" He took a breath, his grip tightening slightly. "Alara, in the past few months, this place, it has felt more like a home than it has in years. You did that. You brought life back into it. You are not a burden. You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of his earnest, tormented face. "Silas, I won't pretend this is how any man or woman dreams of finding their partner," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I will not let them send you to a workhouse. I will not let them win." He paused, and his next words were quieter, full of a vulnerability that undid her completely. "I made a promise to myself that day at the auction, that I would protect the woman with the brave voice. Marrying you, it is the only way I can keep that promise. But it has to be your choice. I will not force you." She looked at him, at this man who had offered her shelter, then respect, and now the ultimate protection of his name. He was offering her a permanent sanctuary, not out of pity, but out of a fierce, defiant sense of justice and a loyalty she had earned. He was choosing her, not despite her past, but because of the person she had shown herself to be. To marry a blind man she barely knew, to bind herself to him legally because of a cruel town's ultimatum, should have felt like a trap. But looking at Silas Thorne, who stood before her as her staunchest defender, it felt like the only choice that mattered. It felt like coming home. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her arm. "They will not win," she said, her voice echoing his, now clear and steady. "Sunday, then. We will go to the church." A profound relief washed over his face, softening the harsh lines. He nodded slowly. Sunday. They stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with the weight of their decision. It was a pact made not of passion, but of something far deeper. Mutual respect, shared survival, and a quiet, stubborn love that had grown in the unlikeliest of soil. They would face the town together, not as a master and his purchased laborer, but as a man and a woman who had chosen each other against the world. The Sunday they were to be married dawned cold and clear. A brittle, white frost covered the ground, sparkling in the pale morning light. It felt to Alara like the whole world was holding its breath. She dressed in her only good dress, the same worn calico she had arrived in, but she had washed and starched it until it was crisp and mended a small tear near the hem with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She brushed her hair until it shone, pulling it back neatly, refusing to hide her face or her scar. Today, she would meet their judgment head-on. Silas was waiting for her by the wagon. He had put on a clean, threadbare shirt and a dark coat she had helped him brush free of dust. He stood straight and tall, his walking stick in hand, looking for all the world like a man going to solemn duty, not a forced wedding. The ride into town was silent, but it was a silence of shared purpose. When they reached the edge of Redemption Creek, they could see that Sheriff Brody had made good on his promise to make a spectacle of them. A crowd was gathered in front of the small, white-steepled church. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness their humiliation. Alara saw Barlow standing near the front steps, a triumphant smirk on his face, flanked by several of his cronies from the town council. Her stomach churned with a cold, familiar fear. Her hand, resting on the wagon seat, trembled. Silas, as if sensing her terror, reached over and covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and steady. "I am with you," he said, his voice a low reassurance meant only for her. She drew strength from his touch, from the simple, solid promise in his words. She took a deep breath and nodded. "And I with you." He helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood before the crowd. A low murmur went through the onlookers. They were a strange pair, the blind rancher and his scarred bride, a living embodiment of the town's gossip. Silas did not hesitate. He took her arm, tucking it securely into the crook of his own, and began to walk toward the church steps. The crowd parted before them, their faces a mixture of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. Alara kept her eyes fixed forward on the church door, refusing to meet any of their gazes. She could feel Barlow's stare like a physical weight. As they reached the steps, Barlow stepped forward to block their path. "Going through with it, Thorne," he boomed, playing to the crowd. "Going to chain yourself to this damaged thing? Have you no pride?" Silas stopped. He turned his face slowly toward the sound of Barlow's voice. The entire square fell silent, waiting for the blind man's response. "Pride." Silas's voice was calm, but it carried across the square with surprising power. "You talk to me of pride, Barlow? You, who publicly shamed a woman for the crime of not pleasing your eye. You, who incited this town to cruelty to soothe your own wounded vanity." He took a step closer, Alara still on his arm. "Let me tell you what I know of this woman. I know she can swing an axe better than most men I've met. I know she can calm a spooked horse with a word. I know she can make a home out of nothing but dust and determination. These are the things I know." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You all look at her and see a scar." His voice grew louder, filled with a righteous anger that made several people in the crowd shuffle their feet uncomfortably. "You see something spoiled or damaged. I have not had the privilege of seeing Miss Hale's face, but I have seen her character. I have seen her courage. I have seen her kindness. I see a woman of more worth and substance than any of you who stand here judging her." He then did something that stunned the crowd into absolute silence. He turned to Alara, and his free hand came up to her face, his calloused fingers tracing the path of her scar with an incredible feather-light gentleness. It was not a touch of curiosity, but of reverence, of acceptance. "This mark," he said, his voice softening, becoming intimate despite the public stage, "is not a flaw. This is a map of her survival. It proves she has known pain and she has endured. It is a sign of her strength, a strength you are all too blind to see." He dropped his hand and turned back to the crowd, his sightless eyes sweeping over them. "So yes, I am proud. I am proud to have this woman stand by my side. Now, if you'll excuse us, the preacher is waiting." He drew Alara forward, and this time no one stood in their way. Barlow was left standing on the steps, his face a mask of sputtering, impotent rage. The crowd parted for them. Their expressions changed. The scorn was gone, replaced by a grudging respect, and in some faces, a profound shame. Alara felt as if she were floating. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of a heart that had been broken and was now, impossibly, being made whole. He had not only defended her, he had celebrated her, turning her greatest shame into her greatest strength. Inside the church, the minister, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked at them with a new understanding. He had heard every word. The ceremony was short and simple. When he asked Silas if he would take this woman to be his wife, Silas's I will, with a vow that resonated with all the power of his public declaration. When it was her turn, Alara looked at the man beside her, this quiet, steadfast rancher who had seen her more clearly than anyone with perfect vision. He had heard her voice in the darkness and had answered. I will, she said, and her own voice was clear and strong, without a trace of tremor. It was the voice of a woman who knew her own worth, because he had given it back to her. They walked out of the church, husband and wife, into the pale winter sun. The crowd was still there, but they were quiet now, watching with a different kind of attention. As Silas helped her onto the buckboard, he paused, his hand still holding hers. He leaned in close, his lips near her ear. Mrs. Thorne, he whispered, and the sound of her new name, spoken in his voice, was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The ride back to the ranch was as quiet as the one that had brought them to town, but the silence was transformed. It was no longer a space of caution or uncertainty. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the deep, unspoken understanding of two souls who had found their anchor in each other. The vast, empty landscape no longer felt lonely. It felt like their kingdom. When they arrived, the cabin did not look the same. It was no longer just a shelter or a workplace. As Silas brought the wagon to a stop, Alara looked at the sturdy log walls, the stone chimney from which a wisp of smoke still curled, and saw it for what it now was, their home. Silas set the brake and sat for a moment, his head tilted as if listening to the profound silence of the valley. He turned to her, a small, gentle smile on his face. Welcome home, Alara. She smiled back, knowing he would hear it in her voice. She climbed down from the wagon and waited for him. He moved to join her, and instead of taking his walking stick, he reached for her hand. His fingers interlaced with hers, a natural, easy gesture that spoke volumes more than words. Together, they walked toward the porch. Inside, the fire she had banked that morning still held a warm, glowing heart. The cabin was filled with a soft, welcoming light. Nothing had physically changed, yet everything was different. The two rooms no longer felt like his space and her space. They were a single, shared domain. The rough-hewn table was where they would share their meals, not as employer and employee, but as partners. The patchwork quilt on his bed was a splash of color promising shared warmth against the coming winter nights. Alara went to the small window in what had been her storeroom. Now, it was simply a part of their house. She looked out at the land, at the way the setting sun cast long, blue shadows from the cottonwoods. The world outside the window was vast and sometimes harsh, but within these walls, she had found a peace she had never dreamed possible. Silas came to stand behind her. He couldn't see the view, but he stood with her, sharing the moment. He placed his hands on her shoulders, a gesture of quiet possession and profound tenderness. I never asked, he said softly, his breath warm against her hair. What color are your eyes? She leaned back against his solid frame, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. The question was so simple, so intimate. It was the question of a man who was building a picture of his wife in his mind, a picture made of sound and touch and the truth of her character. They are brown, she said, the color of turned earth in the spring. He nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. I thought so, he murmured, as if it were a detail he had already known. He tightened his hold on her shoulders, a silent promise of steadfastness, of a future built not on what the world could see, but on the enduring strength of what they had found together in the quiet places of the heart. The auction was a ghost, a distant, powerless memory. Here, in this small cabin, with this good and honorable man, she was not spoiled goods. She was treasured. She was home. I'm now presenting the outro as requested. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.